I'm in this for the data as far as what I do professionally. That is kind of the holy grail. How do we tie everything together? How do we actually reap the benefits for organizations and then pass those benefits and better environment, work environment, and culture on to our staff so we can keep them and grow them over time?
Clock in, scrub up, and join us behind the red line. You're listening to First Case, a perioperative podcast bringing you exciting interviews, engaging discussions, and innovative solutions that are changing the way patients receive surgical care. Each episode, we talk to frontline staff, perioperative leadership, and nursing entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the back table to the boardroom, from wheels in to wheels out, we tackle the real-life issues affecting the OR. Whether you're tuning in for surgical service education or inspiration, we're glad you're here. And now, it's time to roll back and start the first case.
This week on First Case, we speak with Josh Wymer, Chief Nursing Informatics Officer and Vice Chair of Informatics Steering, currently working in the Southern California area. And Paul, we're going to be talking about actionable data today, but really we're going to be talking about the impact that data has on the culture, and really how do we make sure that everybody stays engaged, feels like they have a say, and is doing the right things and constantly looking for ways to improve.
Justin, I had my first OR computer system in 1984, so that's almost 40 years ago. And to see where it's gone in that time frame is just amazing. The amount of data you can collect, it used to just be the average time of surgery or just scheduling a case. And now we've got so much more that can be tracked and trended and help with predicting what's going on in the operating room and supporting the procedures in so many ways. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what Josh has to say about where it's headed in the future.
All right. Well, we're going to be right back after a short break with Josh Wymer.
Hi, I'm Paul Wafer.
I'm Melanie Ferry.
I'm Jeremy Gibson-Rohr.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
A 17 Studios production, you're listening to First Case.
Joining us now is Josh Wymer, Chief Nursing Informatics Officer and Vice Chair of Informatics Steering, currently working in the Southern California area. And Josh, really excited to have you on the show today. Thanks so much for coming on.
It's absolutely a privilege to be here. And before we get started, I would like to share that the views I'm going to share with your audience today are my own and do not necessarily reflect the policy or position of the Department of Defense, the U.S. government, or the U.S. Navy.
All right. Well, I appreciate you saying that and reading that, because it means that you're working on the front lines and you're doing great work. And I love getting insights from people who are really just immersed in the day-to-day. And when we talk about being immersed into the day-to-day, we may be talking about, the workforce. And we're going to take an interesting spin in the conversation that we're having with you about how do we use data, analytics, innovation, technology to shape that workforce culture, because culture is one of those things that, man, when it's good, it's great. And when it's not, it can really take the whole team down with it. And I feel like getting that objective kind of measurement has been very elusive in the industry. So this is going to be a unique conversation. Appreciate you coming on and sharing your insights. But first, tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, thank you. It's a privilege to be here. Yeah, almost 25 years in healthcare, with now 13 or 14 as a nurse and the last 11 as an OR nurse. And recently, in the last 4 or 5 years, have really moved into the informatics space. And it's exciting to be here to have a conversation with you, because I think that everything that we do in surgical services or the OR space tied to care of our patients during the most vulnerable moment since they were in the womb is a big deal. And it's always a privilege to be a part of that process.
Well, it's also a stressful environment, right? And it's high demand. And, that's where that culture can really be tested. But even from more than that, when things aren't working smoothly and efficiently, that just continues to add stress into the situation. So why are efficient workflows so important?
Well, I think you touched on it. It is high stress, and there's this exponential growth in innovation and the evolution of surgical services, the hardware we use, the implants, the surgical procedures that arise out of those opportunities, the novel approaches with certain surgical cases that, better patient outcomes or ease recovery. I think that, when it comes to innovation and having a culture that embraces growth, it's always about that patient outcome, but it's also about keeping our teams whole and helping our individual team members to grow and maximize their potential.
I think also one of the things that's happening in the industry is this, the nursing shortage, the one that they've been telling us about. And now here we are. And so that also places more and more stress on the environment, working overtime, not having enough staff, and surgical volumes really can't drop off right now just with the way that the finances have been working and healthcare and the supply chain strain. So, when we talk about maximizing the staff we do have, isn't it ever more important that things, are like no redundancy, kind of that lean process is really something that we have to strive for?
Yes, you've highlighted, this is a high demand work center. It is the revenue generator for 60+% of healthcare entities. It is a cash positive department for most organizations. So being efficient, reducing the number of touches, like you said, redundancy is the enemy, streamlining workflows while not introducing any additional risk or exposure for the patient care itself is vital. And you also highlighted on this technology that makes us better in surgery. It has further accelerated issues like staff mobility. It's not just the nurses, it's the surgeons, it's the anesthesiologists, it's the surgical techs. They can go where, and they can discover quite easily where they can reap the highest value for their incredible skills. So I think that there is a certain challenge there, but there's also a beautiful cross-leveling within the industry.
When you talk about streamlining workflows and reducing redundancy, I hate redundancy. I just repeated myself and that was redundant. So here we go. But we do so many things that just seem like we're going in circles and why are we doing both things? But when you evaluate what's redundant and what you can get rid of and only add it if it's really necessary, where does the determining factor come in? When do we choose to add something because we really need it? And when do we look at this is redundant, we don't need to do it? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So what isn't redundant is good quality, safe, continuous care. And I think when you look at the last couple of years, there's some really good peer-reviewed articles out there from medicine and the nursing management side that really focus on the fact that many of our systems, even in this modern era, are not woven in to the fabric of our data. They're not woven into, hardwired into kind of the universal perspective of what surgical services, perioperative nursing, surgical technology should be. So we have many camps where we're doing our best, but we don't have a unified kind of approach. And I think that that's one of the real opportunities that, case durations, resource utilization, costs of all types. How are we managing this? And, for somebody who loves data, I'm in this for the data as far as what I do professionally. That is kind of the holy grail. How do we tie everything together? How do we actually reap the benefits for organizations and then pass those benefits and better environment, work environment, and culture on to our staff so we can keep them and grow them over time?
I certainly understand the benefits of having a great IT system, but I also see, especially in older physicians, guys that are my age and older, they're very challenged at integrating those systems into their practice. Is there a way you are able to approach that with them to get them more in alignment with what you're doing at your facility?
So I think this is something you can speak to with very broad strokes because it's very similar to other industries, other leadership challenges out there. This is about buy-in. Some of the biggest players out there, Gartner just had an article this year about, how do we bring data into our decision making and what data actually matters. Is analytics a core skill? And as a customer, that physician, that surgeon is a customer of their surgical services department. What are we doing to support them and show them what matters? And, the consumer, the patient, the surgical case, that patient is getting way smarter. Dr. Google, if you will, and that the information is all out there. And then they're holding us more accountable for quality and outcomes. So I think that's a part of the story is we need to bring the data that matters to our partners, in this case, as you referred to, the surgeons. But it doesn't just matter data for the business side. We've been getting hit over the head with data from the business side for decades. It matters from a safety. It matters from a optimized outcomes perspective. And surgeons are all on board with that because that's how they're judged against their peers.
How do you eliminate the amount of required data entry during a procedure? I mean, to me, that's one of the biggest things I hear from nurses in the operating room is they're getting tied to their computer because they have so much to document. Is there anything that is being done to help reduce that? Because that impacts workflow as well.
Yes, for sure. And I think that the magic of that, it goes back to fundamental clinical informatics skills. And a lot of it involves templating, dot phrases, things that I will bore your audience if we get too deep into. But ultimately, a lot of that pre-work is not unique to each surgical case. It just needs to be customized to reflect the care provided to the surgical case. So again, just noting that this is my personal perspective and opinion. But I think that, when we show our providers, our surgeons, our clinicians, our individual team members, where the value is, I don't think it's a lack of willingness to do the work. I think it's showing purpose and value in what they do that matters.
So you just talked about, I think, actionable data and meaningful data. And so it's really going to be baked into strategy. Sometimes you see people pull data elements together and they just kind of plop it on the table. And you're talking about that internal customer and the surgeon. And it's really about gaining alignment, right? Like, this is what we have. This is who we are. And then they can actually say, yeah, that seems right to me. Or maybe they say, no, that doesn't seem right. Let me challenge it. And then you're able to walk them back to the source of the data. And then they're like, oh, okay, I never really considered that before. So I think sometimes people think that the data is simply, an end all be all point of this assessment right here. But really, I think where it's valuable is what kinds of questions does it get the team asking that they weren't asking themselves, or maybe see something that was going on that they weren't looking at before. Would you agree with that?
I would, but I would point to the fact, I'm not an evangelist for data as a topic, et cetera. I'm an evangelist for good data, quality data. When you look at data sets, there are a lot of incredible data sets out there, but what is the source? How is it clean data? Is it purposeful data? I think we have to go back to relationships, and I focus on relationships in what I do when it comes to having those internal and external customers. And MIT had a great article earlier this year where they pointed to the fact that companies that leverage all the data that's available to them, the data that actually matters, their growth is proven to be double digits ahead of their competitors. And so I think this is a call to be better at looking at our data. This is a call to choosing the data that aligns to our strategic initiatives within our organization. If it doesn't align to your mission, your vision, and your goals, you need to go back to the drawing board. So also just understanding that improving care and efficiency matters, but if it doesn't add value or have meaning to your team, it's not going to be realized.
Well, that brings up a good question. What kind of data do you share with your team? How do you use the data to keep the team focused on what they're doing or seeing the improvement that they're making?
Sure. So this would vary based on whether we're talking about the high-level strategic or operational leader, whether this is the staff at the surgical field or if it's your staff down in processing, right? Everybody has data that matters and it needs to be complementary. And I think that that's what matters. What data matters to each role, and then how do you measure it? Because it needs to be time limited, it needs to be sensitive, it needs to be high fidelity, and by that I mean it has all the components that actually matter, and it is not sloppy or dirty in some way, because we can collect an immense amount of data these days with all the ways we've integrated technology. But does it actually serve the purpose? You know, I think with something as simple as RFID, when that came into surgical services and we were able to start to comprehensively track the use of individual surgical instruments and sets, know where they are, which is everybody who's been around for any time knows that that in and of itself, lost productivity is a huge cost issue. That, you know, even though it's been 4 or 5 years since I physically touched a patient on the OR bed, I believe I'm still a very impactful and meaningful OR nurse because I'm contributing to all of care by finding that data to support my teams. And I think that that's what we need to emphasize is everyone matters. And if they're not getting the data they need, please come and engage with us and help us get that buy-in. Because if everybody is engaged, we'll discover that with them.
How do you communicate that data to the staff and ensure that they understand it? Because that, to me, that's where there is sometimes a breakdown.
Yes. So that is obviously there needs to be retrospective data. There needs to be time sensitive. So 24 hours, week, monthly, quarterly, annual statistics. But this is going to be so specific to each of your listeners' organizations. I think I would more focus in on, do they feel equipped? Do they know, if they don't know where they can improve, it doesn't matter how good they are, they're not as good as they could be. Do they know what the goals are? You know, are they focused? And this is quite commonly used. It's used by the Navy SEALs. It's used by every successful corporate consultancy and organization out there. Are we making that 1% difference every day? And if we do that over time, we're going to get better. And, you know, no one owns trademark on that process. You don't have to pay licensing or royalties on that. Just look at your processes and try to be that 1% better, and your organization will win over time.
Okay, so you're talking about the 1% and being 1% better every single day. And we want our staff to buy into that and to improve. But how do you collect this data and use this data in a way where they don't feel like they're being penalized and it is something that is productive for the whole department?
And that's probably one of the biggest challenges, because if someone feels observed or that there's going to be some sort of a punitive element, there tends to be a little bit less buy-in. But I think this goes back to the concept of the culture within our organizations, the power of an innovating and growing and inclusive and just feeling heard within that OR culture, a culture that's open to ideas, a culture that empowers everyone to make a difference, and ultimately that power to think big, be the solution, that power for every individual on your team to have and know and be the solution for your organization.
I want to ask a question about data that comes from your vendor partners or your suppliers, and that does factor in a lot to the strategy, but do we have less control over that data? And then if so, how do you qualify the validity of the data that's being provided?
Sure. So again, I'll highlight that this is my individual perspective and opinion, but always be skeptical of partner data. As someone who's in clinical systems and works with some incredible hardware and systems professionals on the team, your risk is typically with data that you're not clear on. So again, no offense to the amazing partners that I have and I work with and I implicitly trust in many ways, but you know, the trust but verify is very important. We've all had that experience with sales tied to devices or the like, but understanding that we can't get there without partners is also a key. Those that go it alone soon find themselves alone, and it's usually at the back of the pack. And so finding a way to develop those trusting relationships, not just accept data, but, you know, understand the data that is being shared with us, and then seeing if it aligns, because a lot of data is shared with you to get to at least kick off or to start the evolution of a partnership. But I think over time, we can really begin to understand what matters to us within that data, and then also put it back on our partner to bring us the data we actually want, because they have it. They're probably shaping their message a little bit.
Well, I think you just brought up a really good point too, was that, if you can direct the kind of data that you want versus accepting the data that you get, that also puts you in a little bit of a driver's seat, because you can say, this is what I need to know. I know what you're telling me, but this is what I need to know. Can you tell me this? Have you been in those kinds of situations as well?
I think what you're highlighting is agency. And we need to give our team members, especially our team leads and our middle managers and our lower operational level leaders, the agency to have that kind of a communication with our partners. If we have, even at the surgical field, these conversations often begin there because it's viewed as an opportunity by somebody in the partnership. And I would say it's probably somebody external trying to introduce something into your internal processes. So are we empowering our teams from the surgical field to the supply department, to all the other departments, all the way through central processing? Are we empowering them to represent us and have those tough conversations? Because quite often that ask needs to come earlier, and it needs to come before either side has reaped the full benefits. Because if you don't get that connection, you don't have that kind of shared understanding of the value that's there, you're not going to maximize the partnership.
We talked a little bit about, the wealth of data. And, I think Paul kind of teed up that question about, how do we narrow the data down? But, a supporting department that you just mentioned that seems to be starved for data, almost completely opposite of the operating room, would be central supply. And so how do you find that getting the kind of data you need out of that support service area, is different than trying to comb through data that you might have all kinds of that does, and trying to make it meaningful in the OR? Don't you feel like there's a major contrast in those two departments when it comes to data?
Yes, and there's a difference in the culture around evidence-based practice, around pursuing the latest in knowledge and innovation. And it's no insult to that group or that department. It's just a different culture, right? And I think that is a great opportunity for us to, even if there isn't developing body of evidence around a particular topic or an area we're curious about, internally we can control for that data that we have. Because there is data there. It's just a matter of recording it and tracking it over time. So that is a decision on the part of the organization to not acquire and filter and assess that data. And I think that you also highlight that there are plenty of opportunities out there for innovative minds with a goal to make things better. I'm under no delusion that we are somehow going to experience a decrease in the rate of innovation and technology, at least based on, what I see the traffic in the departments across the facility here.
Josh, one of the things that I observe when I'm out doing my consulting work is that it's great to have this data, but like in the OR, you have to have support to make sure that the data is up to date. For example, preference lists. If you don't have a team or designated people to update those preference lists, then your data becomes old and not really accurate. So then if you multiply that with your pre-op area and your sterile processing area, you've got a lot of challenges there to maintain that data. How do you manage that? As a chief informatics person, how do you make sure that all those other systems keep current with accurate information?
As someone who's definitely on the strategic and operational leadership side, my advice to a department to help them succeed would be that the high-performing organizations track their preference cards, actively curate them, monitor how often changes or the rate of changes or even the defects. So what was required to be brought into the room for that individual surgical case that wasn't reflected on the card? And are there trends for that provider that we should place that item there? So I do know that within high performing surgical teams that they do that. And the subsequent carry on to that is, are we managing? It's just similar to managing, rotating our supply. We have plenty of data to know what we have in inventory. Typically, we have plenty of managing the rotation of that. But are we aware of that just in time expectation that's really starting to get pushed out everywhere across our industry? And where are we missing opportunities that we really should not have capital or funds of any type sitting in central core or in a warehouse somewhere, when that revenue needs to be somewhere else helping our organization be healthy?
I think that supply chain piece you just mentioned is so critical. And we've had so many episodes on how to get, that kind of engagement and that collaboration going. And it's such a huge opportunity. There's no doubt. And especially now, you said just in time, and that was the way of everything. And now it's really been carved back because of all the supply chain disruption. So this is another place where data can have an impact on culture, because guess what? We got blindsided. And so we talked about all that stress, and all of a sudden you can't do things the way you did yesterday. Do you feel like there are organizations that were better prepared out there because of the data that they were collecting and the types of collaboration that they had with supply chain?
Well, I think there are plenty of organizations. Again, this is my personal opinion and perspective. There are plenty of organizations that have gone back and shaped a story. But I would say that, the majority of our organizations experienced something that we could never have planned for with COVID-19 on so many levels. And then we had the commiserate supply chain challenges, which is, I had a place where there was going to be an EHR conversion, and all my hardware and systems stuff was going to be there in this warehouse. And all of a sudden it's full of COVID-19 supplies, disposable supplies, and totally have to pivot on delivery, timetables, et cetera, to support quite a big endeavor. And I think that there are lessons to be learned. I think the organizations that will come through this having been stronger after COVID are those organizations that are really good at pivoting, really good at knowing the skills of their people and leveraging them to their maximum potential.
Okay, I have another question for you, but it goes back to something you and I actually talked about before we ever did this podcast. So I want you to bring everybody else into our conversation. But we talked a little bit we were talking about technology, and we've been doing that today and talking about data collecting. But why should nurses and scrub techs too, why should people in the OR department care? Why will this information and this data, why will it help us?
Yes, so data, innovation, technology, it all matters because it is the future. It's going to drive where we're going. It is going to take you on this journey, even if you choose to try to not get on. And I think that the challenges we have is getting that buy-in at the edges of our teams. We have the early adopters. They're there before us. They can't wait. When we make an announcement or we roll out something new, they're right at that first step, ready to go. Then we have the bulk of our staff. They're willing. They're going to engage. They're going to contribute. They're going to grow with us. And then we do have 15% laggards that we really need to own that development. And I think that no matter what phase of that experience the listeners to this episode find themselves in, there's a real opportunity to establish and grow buy-in. The culture we talked about earlier it needs to be one that's open, communicative, involves trust. And that takes time. That takes habits. That takes proving yourself as a leader. That includes making sure that we do support them through plenty of challenges. And I would say the last 18 months, I've deployed with the military. I've done some challenging professional things, but the last 18 months with COVID, mentally and physically, were probably the most challenging. And we were wearing masks way before it was cool. And we were doing, going through so many of the things that we've experienced, but it just changed the context of society, even the fabric of our society, the daily experience, the ability to have let down after your shift and recover. And I think that if we don't show that personal relationship or understanding of the human side of our teammates, that it's really going to be hard to get the buy-in from them on a personal, impacting, and professional level, because the future is coming, and those organizations that engage and get their teams on board and maximize their contribution, they're going to succeed.
Well, as it so often does happen on this podcast with an excellent guest like yourself, Josh, the time flies by. I can't even believe it. And before we wrap, I kind of wanted to tee it up for you, like anything that you feel like we didn't cover that you want to add, or some final thoughts, as everybody out there is kind of considering, where they're at in where we're headed, and, what they can do. I love the term early adopter. I mean, as an entrepreneur, that's just music to my ears every time I hear somebody say that. It's like, oh, that's who I like to be with. And people are out there adopting, this concept, they're putting these things into practice. What are maybe some things you'd add before we wrap?
Well, I would challenge your listeners. They're accomplished. They have a unique set of skills. They have a unique perspective. They have their own professional history. They have a list of accomplishments. I would challenge them to look at that and see how they can apply it to make their team better, their organization better, and look, just kind of as you highlighted with the early adopter component in any organization. What agency do they have that they can grow and maximize? What entrepreneurial bent do they have? Even if they don't want to start a business, how can they take that spirit and that drive to contribute and grow? How can they take that into their professional environment and make that place better and grow their own opportunity? And I think that the future is very bright. This is not a matter of forcing anyone to want to talk or engage with on a particular topic. I think this is a matter of showing the humanity and the awesomeness that can be achieved with what we have in front of us. But it's also about proving value and giving that back to our teams and our communities. And if we do that and we make engaging with innovation and technology and even data, which makes a lot of people sometimes shut down, if we can prove the value, I think we're going to get that buy-in. And ultimately, the whole concept of thinking bigger, we can be bigger and better ourselves individually.
All right. Well, really nice job on this episode. And like I said, maybe we'll have to have you come back for another topic in the future, because that ran by really quick. Really a pleasure having you on the show, Josh. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
That was Josh Wymer, Chief Nursing Informatics Officer and Vice Chair of Informatics Steering, currently working in the Southern California area. And I think one of the things that we have actually been talking about a lot throughout this first year plus of First Case has really been around this culture, but we've also had lots of conversations around technology and data. And then this conversation today is pulling all of that together and really trying to help empower organizations, I guess, with how they can take a more entrepreneurial, a little more, my favorite word, early adopter kind of stance, because as Josh told us, this is where it's headed. We're all going to get swept up in this, and it's where we're going in the future.
I agree. You see it every day in the OR with new things that show up, new products that come in, new programs. Like you said, early adopters and picking it up, but how all of this really does affect our culture and improving those workflows and making things efficient and still continuing to have that safe continuity of care that we need to have for our patients every single day. But being able to incorporate that technology and the data and our OR culture in this streamlined process is just interesting to see how it all unfolds.
All right, that's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can help support First Case by subscribing on Apple, Amazon, or Google Podcasts. You can also find us on Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast application. You can also access bonus content for certain episodes. All you have to do is download our smartphone app for iPhone and Android. And while you're there, we'd appreciate a rating and a review because your feedback is important to the show. On behalf of Paul, Melanie, and myself, thank you for listening to this week's episode of First Case.